Since this is my first time ever taking myself seriously, I figured now was a good time to turn on my LED lights. Give them a go. Just to drive home how serious I am about this. You know what would make this more serious? And I'm also using a color-changing baby spoon. Please take me seriously. Okay, this isn't any easy question to answer, even though it is a yes or no question, and for all I know, it may not even be answerable. But something being impossible has never made me shy away from it in the past, so why start now? Aren't I so inspiring? Anyways, I just wanted to preface this by saying, even though this is probably going to be longer than most of my videos, this will still be a very brief exploration of the question, because there are so many angles you could come at when trying to answer it, and even more rabbit holes that you could fall down. And I would be lying to you if I said that I hadn't tried to make a video about this before, but it's a really complex question, so I had to do a lot of organization. I knew this video would take a lot of prep work, so I whipped out the flashcards and Crayola markers, as I'm sure every one of my scholarly forefathers has done before me, and I started planning. I basically just had to collect all of my thoughts about this topic into one place and then separate them out by some arbitrary similarity they had, and then record. So let's see if I've done enough preparation. I have to have my computer in front of me because, let's be honest, I have the attention span of a chihuahua after consuming 3 pounds of crack. Let's begin. What is free will? Google says it's the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion. And I agree with that, but it's a bit broad for my taste, which is ironic because most of the statements I make are practically the definition of broad. So I'd like to specify it a bit. I like to think of free will as the conscious ability to make our own decisions, not necessarily just the ability to act whichever way we choose, because for all we know, our actions could be predetermined. But if we have true free will, we'll have the ability to decide whether we want to act in that way. So basically what I'm trying to say is, Google, I think it's time to go home. There's a new sheriff in town. Now I'm gonna bore you with a teensy itty bitty bit of history about the discussion of free will. I'm going to start with ancient Greece because a lot of the thoughts that came out of that era tended to shape a lot of philosophy up until the mid-19th century. Good old Plato, or Socrates. I don't really know who's credited with this idea. I assume it's Socrates because he was the teacher and Plato was the student, but it's just so much more fun to say Plato. And he was technically the author, so that's gotta count for something. Okay, see, philosophy is already really confusing, but good old Socrates believed that humans have a specific purpose. Like a tool has a purpose to make rockin' music and fix things. He talks a lot about humans having a specific purpose to fulfill so that their society moves seamlessly and collectively, an assembly line of human beings, if you will. He believed that we were all born with a specific talent or inclination, and we were supposed to study that and fulfill that during our entire life, and that was our meaning. And if the idea of that scares you, don't worry. They lived in a different time. And Socrates actually hated the idea of democracy because he thought that it would get rid of the collective idea of morality and then make people feel useless because they would be searching their entire life for meaning and then never know if or when they found it. Sound familiar? Now, of course, I'm paraphrasing and generalizing a lot of what are still considered the most important ideals of philosophy, but I mean, those are the basics for what we're gonna need in this discussion, so. And a lot of arguments, including modern arguments, are based in Plato's writings. For example, Christianity has a huge influence from Plato's writings. But that's a discussion entirely of its own, and I could waste a lot of time talking about it, so we're gonna move on. But it's an important comparison for this, and you'll see why later. Now, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we've got existentialism. You have to do this every time you say existentialism, otherwise it doesn't count. And it's hard to choose just one writer for existentialism because, as it turns out, it's a pretty popular philosophy in the West. And let's be honest, most of the world. So we'll just have to use the very broad generalizations I've made about existentialism for this discussion. The whole premise of existentialism is that there's no specific meaning for humans, generally speaking. Generally, we don't have a purpose like a tool has a purpose. There's also the assumption that existentialism is the complete opposite of religion, which isn't completely true. Thanks, Nietzsche. For anyone who didn't get that joke, Nietzsche was the one that famously wrote that God was dead. But a common argument made in existentialism is because we don't have a specific purpose for living, we can just experience life how it is, in all its unfiltered glory. Something that Socrates' perfect world wouldn't be able to do. It makes sense that existentialism is the opposite of Platonism because it's the philosophy for the world that Socrates wanted to avoid. In existentialism, we can try out everything and experience the world for what it is. At least, if you're an optimist. There are plenty of optimistic and pessimistic twists in existentialism, but that's the basic stuff we're gonna need to know for the discussion. So the way I see it, there are two literal ways we could not have free will. We've got short-term and long-term constrictions. Short-term is like if we didn't have control over every single action. A popular example of this is if we were living in a simulation. Not only would we not have control over our environment or our personalities, we also wouldn't have control over almost every action that we take. This would mean that everything we do has nothing to do with us, and it's all just some hollow movement we've been programmed or requested to do from our controller, which would lead us down a deep dark hole of questioning our reality and our instincts, because if somebody's controlling us, is anything we do or think real? But a more common argument about not having free will is long-term. That would be if we had a predetermined motive or goal. We see this a lot in religion with remarks like, oh, don't worry, God has a plan for you, or oh, it's all part of the plan, everything happens for a reason, etc. We also saw it in Plato's definition of humanity because he believed that we were all born with something that we could nurture and benefit society with, and we had no choice in making the decision what we were going to do with our life. But this long-term argument offers a bit more freedom than short-term, because hopefully deciding to walk your dog isn't going to stop you from fulfilling the purpose God has made for you. So in this argument, you have the ability to make short-term decisions. And actually, if you think about it, this long-term predetermination is really just a broad definition of purpose, which leads us perfectly into the next topic, which is the types of ways that we have free will. Or more accurately, the way we have free will. Really, there's only one, and it's just having free will. Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward concept, but the arguments we hear most defending free will's existence come mainly from existentialists. Nothing matters, and that's because nothing's controlling us or giving us purpose. Of course, it is possible for our lives to be meaningless and still be controlled by someone, but generally existentialists believe that we're all alone in this world and we have to fend for ourselves. And we have free will to make whatever decisions we want. But I've kind of come up with a safety blanket for myself to stop myself from falling into that pit of meaninglessness. Although, it's not really even a safety blanket. As a matter of fact, sometimes it makes me feel worse. Anyways, let's assume that we do have free will, and nothing means anything. Just for a second. Even in this case, we still don't have free will. We're still controlled by our world. For example, close your eyes and think of a city. From anywhere in the world, any population or size, it doesn't matter. Just choose one. What did you think of? It probably wasn't
Siglufjörður.
Iceland, unless you live in
Siglufjörður.
Iceland, because you either don't know about it or you just weren't thinking about it. Now, I'm not going to take credit for that question and answer thing. I actually heard it from my friend once, and even then they probably heard it from someone else, so, you know, socialization. But it brought up a really good argument to me about how limited our reality is. See, I didn't know about
Siglufjörður.
until I went out of my way to find out about it. And that's how most things in life work. Our entire existence is limited by our knowledge. We can't want for something that we don't know exists. But what scares me about our knowledge is that it's completely hingent upon our environment, which is completely random. I could have been born in
Siglufjörður.
and then I definitely would have known about it. But I wasn't. And there's also this whole socioeconomic theory about how where you're born affects your aspirations and goals in life way more than you would expect it to. But we're not talking about that, so I'm just gonna throw it out there and let you start thinking about how limited your scope of reality is and how controlled you are by your society. So see, in that way, any glimpse of free will we could have had is no longer existent. And we're back to not having free will. But this time just a little bit more pessimistic. That's nice, isn't it? However, there are ways of making yourself feel like you're not as constricted by your environment, but they mainly consist of education, and well, it's boring, so... But still, if you were born in a place where you didn't have the option to educate yourself and gain control of your own reality, you wouldn't know anything other than that reality. And that's a scary thing. So be grateful that you can make choices. And in the same vein as this argument, I always like to try to figure out why we have the instincts that we have. Say I knew about
Sê kleuverder.
why would I choose Chicago instead? This is a question that I like to play around in my head with, but I never end up coming to an answer, because to some extent it depends on what I recently had on my mind. Maybe earlier that day I was listening to Chicago, and it just happened to be fresh in my mind. Or maybe we really genuinely don't have free will, and I just make all my decisions because something is controlling me. I don't know. And now that that's done, why do we care if we have free will? At this point in humanity, it almost seems like there's something instinctual in us that makes us anxious when we think about even the possibility of not having free will. Which is ironic because being able to make our own decisions is terrifying. And yet, the idea of being completely alone in this world with nothing pushing us towards meaningfulness also makes us very anxious. We're terrified of the idea of having free will, and we're also terrified of the idea of not having free will. Welcome to the paradox we like to call reality. But in the democratic society that we live in, I have to agree with Socrates just a little bit. We have so many choices that even if we were given a purpose at birth, it would be so hard to find it. And finding yourself is a natural part of growing up. So it's almost implied to us that we don't have free will, but we're just thrown into the wild and expected to find our purpose. I can't really come up with a yes or no to the original question, but I think there's some comfort in both. If we do have free will, then we can just choose to do whatever we want and enjoy life for what it is. Never have to worry about doing anything meaningful with it. Even though there's something in human nature that makes us instinctually want to search for meaning. But still, it would be really comforting to know that you're not disappointing some ethereal being by watching TV instead of becoming a prodigy. But there's also comfort in the idea of not having free will. You may be trapped in your own body, but at least you know that everything happens for a reason, and someone or something is looking out for you. It also means that we do have meaning, and being alive isn't just for nothing. So take that as you will, but don't feel too bad about any of it. It's kind of scary to ask questions like these because it's almost like you're questioning everything that you've ever known. And that's terrifying. My advice is to find something that you genuinely enjoy and spend your time doing it. Distract yourself. That's what I always do. But yeah, that's my brief exploration of the question of free will. I say exploration because I know that I didn't answer anything, but that's philosophy for you. Actually, no, that's life for you. They're practically synonymous. So, yeah. Have a good day. Bye! Am I only blinking with one eye? Okay, cool, I'm done being serious now. I can take this out.